Welcome back, casual gardeners. This video is going to be all about drip irrigation. I've made drip irrigation videos before. The goal with this video is to give you so much information. It'll be like drinking from a hose. Hoses are what this video is all about. This video is going to have a ton of chapters in it, and the chapters are there to help you navigate to the information that you're interested in. This video is for folks that have a garden that is relatively small. If you're irrigating like a market garden or a small farm, you're gonna have to do some more math. If you're too big for my video, you're still welcome to watch it, and I hope you enjoy it. But I'm gonna leave out some details that you need, and I am sorry, but that's just the way it is. Now let's talk about the source for your drip irrigation system. You've got options. You can convert from an existing sprinkler system. Some people say that it will go horribly wrong and things are going to be awful, but no, every drip irrigation system at my last house was converted from my existing irrigation system, and it was fine. You just screw the head off, replace it with your conversion kit. Make sure it includes a filter and a pressure regulator. Pressure regulators with sprinkler conversion kits usually only regulate down to 30 psi, which is adequate for everything but drip tape. You can run off as many sprinkler heads as you want. The only downside of converting from sprinklers is that you will be forced to follow the same schedule as the rest of that sprinkler zone. So you're going to have to find a compromise between your lawn's needs and your garden's needs, and that's not always easy. Here at my new Mojo Dojo Casa house, I am running my drip irrigation system from my hose bib. You will still need a pressure regulator. Let me show you. So here is the pressure through the pressure regulator. It's still pretty impressive. So that's what 20 psi looks like. And then here is, ooh, it's gonna get me. Here is unregulated. Okay, and that really doesn't illustrate it very well. This is more than 5 times as much pressure as this. But I run everything off my hose bib, and you can see I've got a manifold here. You're gonna want to include a manifold because that way you can run your hose without disconnecting your drip irrigation system, and your life will be 200% better. You can also run off of a well or off of this is a canal irrigation system that has a cool thing here. I've actually got a pressure regulator in line. It's not necessary. I want to get this hooked up through the big hole instead of the little hole. If you run off a dirty water source, make sure that you have a healthy filter in line with your system, a hefty filter. This one I like a lot because it's got a flush valve, so I can flush out my filter just by turning a valve. This will also help keep a lot of the seeds from my canal irrigation from winding up in my garden. Now, if you collect rainwater and you're like, but I want to run my irrigation system off rainwater, you can do that too. You will want to make your water column as high as you possibly can, and you're going to want to have your spigot for your irrigation system come out as low on your water column as you possibly can, so that you can get some sort of pressure to drive that water through your system. You need a big barrel or a small system, but you can do it. Those are knobby tires. Whatever your source is, you will want to include some kind of filtration. If you're running off culinary water, a simple mesh filter will do. I showed you the Beefy filter for a dirtier source. If you have a really hard water, you may also consider putting a calcium inhibitor in line. That'll just reduce the amount of calcium buildup at your emitters and make your system live a little bit longer. Although if you use something cheap like drip tape, it might be more cost effective and less effort to just replace the drip tape as the emitters clog. The pressure or flow rate for your system is going to depend on what your emitters are and how many emitters you have. For a smaller system, you don't have to do the emitter math. Just generally, drip tape needs a pressure of 8 to 15 psi. Button emitters can go all the way up to 50 psi. The emitter tubing that you get at the big box stores operates best between 15 and 25 psi. And soaker hoses are technically a type of drip irrigation.
Is that the soaker hose you two made?
They tend to put out a lot more volume than a traditional drip emitter. I'm going to include them in the category of drip irrigation anyway. The specifications of soaker hoses vary widely though, so you're on your own there. If you have any doubts about the pressure you need for your system, just keep track of what the lowest pressure emitter you have is and set your system pressure to that pressure. Because you can't blow out an emitter with excessively low pressure, but you can with really high pressure. They will explode. It's kind of cool, but expensive. If you want to know for sure what the pressure from a source is, you are going to want a pressure meter and you're going to attach it to your source and measure your pressure. If you want to know what your flow rate at your source is, you can take a container of known volume and time how long it takes to fill the container. If you use one of the big box store 5-gallon buckets, keep in mind that 5-gallon buckets hold more than 5 gallons. So what you would ideally do is measure in from a gallon container 5 times and then mark the fill line at 5 gallons in your bucket and then do your flow rate test because you'll get more accurate results that way. But you only really have to know your flow rate if you are running a larger garden than this. There are some basic steps you can follow that everyone will follow as you design your system. We'll just go over those really quick. So step 1 is identifying where your source is and then identifying where you're going to use the water from that source. You're going to map out the path that you want to take from there. That is your trunk line. You're generally going to want to use 1/2-inch tubing for that. Next, you want to kind of sketch out the path you want to take to get your water to all of its end destinations from the trunk line. So I've got 8 beds, which means that I have to tee off from the trunk at like 8 different destinations. Once you've planned out the branches from your trunk, you're going to want to figure out what kind of emitter system you want to use. And there are some emitters that are better for some tasks and other emitters that are better for other tasks. If you are row cropping large plants in stable configurations, you can do drip line, or you can do emitter tubing, or you can do just the 1/4-inch regular trunk line with button emitters spaced on it. You can just poke your button emitters right in there. If you're doing block planting, which is my favorite way to do it, or you're doing variable crops, so with variable arrangements, and you need the flexible system, you can use drip tape again and make sure your emitters are spaced close and arranged kind of in a grid so that you're hitting your whole bed space. Or you can do a very similar thing with 1/4-inch drip tubing. As you design your system, keep in mind that you can also design things so that they're modular. So for instance, if you have a certain arrangement in a bed that you want to always have for that collection of plants in the bed, and you want to rotate your crops, you can build your drip system so that the whole arrangement for your bed detaches from the main system and can move to the next bed down the line. For a smaller garden, we're probably going to be using vinyl or polypropylene tubing. You do have creative space to work a little PVC into your design if you love PVC. Garden hoses in the US are typically 3/4-inch threads. Everything is at the hose end is going to need to be 3/4-inch. And this is important. Many inline timers and pressure regulators and filter modules and backflow preventers and all those other cool gimcrackery bits are also going to be 3/4-inch. And that is the reason that in my system, you'll tend to see them all put together at the hose end instead of dispersed through the system, because I want to stay in 3/4-inch space as long as I need to and only convert to 1/2-inch space with my actual lines when I'm done in 3/4-inch space. This will save you money and time configuring your pieces. Generally speaking, larger diameter tubing is going to accommodate more flow, and smaller diameter tubing is going to accommodate less flow. There are a bunch of parts that you can use to actually construct your drip system once we're out of hose space and into drip space. You're going to have T's, you're going to have Y's, you're going to have elbows, You're going to want backflow preventers in your system. A backflow preventer does what it says. It makes sure that the water can come through the system in one direction, but not in the other direction. Backflow preventers are useful in at least two situations. Number one is at the hose end. I have a backflow preventer that keeps my system from emptying through the hose system and into my house water, so that I do not accidentally pump bacterial contaminants into my drinking supply and make my whole family sick. Situation number two, where you want a backflow preventer, is if you have multiple sources like I do. I have a backflow preventer over at my secondary water source to keep my culinary water from forcing its way back through the lower pressure system and into the canal. As you're deciding what you want, your T's and L's and Y's and whatever doohickeys, as you're deciding how many and which of those you want to include in your system, you're going to need to decide how those connect to the tubing. And there are actually 4 options now. They all have pros and cons. So you can have a barbed fitting. So that's just barbs on the end that will connect it. Barbed connectors are great. They're reusable. You can put the line on and take it off pretty easily. But if you go with barbed connectors, you also need to use clamps, or else you won't always have a watertight seal and you could lose some money watering things you don't want to. If you're getting your parts from the big box store, your primary option is going to be compression fittings. And there are pros and cons for those. Compression fittings are a durable, reliable, permanent connection. So generally contractors prefer pressure fittings because they have the time and patience and muscle to jam all that stuff together, and then they're done. And if the system needs to be reconfigured, they're not going to be the ones doing it. I don't like how hard it is to assemble pressure fittings. I don't like how a 1/100th of the diameter of the tubing being off can make your pressure fitting incompatible with the tubing that you've got. With the Permalock system, what you have is you've got kind of a barb, like with the barbed fitting. Then you have kind of a screw threaded nut thing. And you can just screw that thread over the barb after you get it over your tubing, and that cinches you in place. So you have a strong connection. You don't have to buy additional clamps to make that strong connection. You've got a reconfigurable connection. So currently, the Permalock system is my favorite system. If you're like, what do I want to use? That's my recommendation. Finally, you have the drip lock system, which is something I don't have experience with. Drip locks are relatively easy to install, and they're reusable, just like the Permalock fixtures. As you are assembling your system, if you go from 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch tubing, you'll also need an appropriately sized barb tubing coupler for each point where you do that. The barb tubing coupler allows you to poke a hole in your 1/2 inch tubing, poke your barb tubing coupler into that hole, and push your narrower diameter tubing onto that other end of that barb coupler. If you poke a hole in the wrong spot, you're going to want a piece called a goof plug. Buy 2 or 3 times as many goof plugs as you think you'll need. Always plan on making mistakes. I don't, and I always regret it. You will be happier with your system if you include valves in your system. If you wanted to, you could have a valve to shut off water flow to an entire bed. You could have valves just for a single row, and you can even have valves that will shut off one emitter. That allows for more customization in how you water. If you're doing container gardening, you can still use a drip system. For containers, I recommend spray emitters, micro sprinklers, or button emitters. You can design your system for a 4-season climate. So if you are watching this in Florida, skip to the next chapter. But if you're watching it in most of the northern United States, this is for you. As you lay out your system, identify low points in the system and put valves in those spots. I have 2 low point valves in my drip system. One is between the hose bib and the system itself. It's actually underneath my greenhouse. And I can open that valve and water will drain from the system underneath my greenhouse and empty my drip system out. I also have a valve over there And that does the same thing, but outside the greenhouse. Before my first frost comes, I detach everything from my hose bib. I take all of my timers off the system and bring them inside. So that's why I don't have timers installed anywhere right now. And then I open up all of the valves everywhere. I allow water to drain out of the system, and that way I'm less likely to have to replace burst tubing. How well does that work? I don't know yet. I haven't turned my drip system on yet because I'm going to get a hard freeze in 2 days. So it's pointless. And if you're still watching and you were wondering why I was manually watering when I have this awesome drip system, now you know. It's not working yet. There are lots of different types of automatic timers that you can get, and they run from low price points to high price points, and you get what you pay for. At the lower price point, you've got mechanical timers, and mechanical timers, often you'll use a couple of batteries to just run a cheap and really basic clock, and at intervals it will open a valve and water the garden. If I wanted to water in the very early morning and at night so that I'm reducing evaporation from the garden, that was not an option with my mechanical timer. Your step up from mechanical timers, and even though it costs more, I recommend you take this step, is to go with an electronic timer. Electronic timers, at the very least, will allow you to program timed watering. When I am running everything again, it will be running off of an electronic timer that runs on Wi-Fi, has an app that I have on my phone so that I can turn it on and off from my phone if I just want to do a quick spot water. It is a smart timer, so it also uses the Wi-Fi to get weather updates, and it will not water in the middle of a rainstorm. All right, so now it gets a little more complicated here. I told you this would be like drinking from a hose. Different soil types and different crop conditions are going to need to be watered with different frequencies and for different durations. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. This is a Beefy video. If you have very sandy soil with low organic content, looking at you, Nevada, you probably already know that that water is just going to shoot down through your sand and into the groundwater and gone, right? So what do? Well, in sandy soil, especially with shallow-rooted crops in sandy soil, you're going to want to do multiple short waterings from your system a day. Plan on watering possibly up to several times a day, but you can still conserve water doing that with a drip system, so it's not as painful as it sounds. And that way you're getting that water down through there, and your plants can actually take some of that up before it runs away from them. Clay soil works very differently. Water doesn't penetrate clay soil very well, and then also clay soil holds onto water really well. So if you have clay soil, and I do, you're going to want to water in 2 shorter intervals when you water, but then you're going to want to take those 2 watering incidences and space them out more, because your soil will stay wet longer in between waterings. If you're in loamy soil, you can do 1 long soak per watering. If you really want to calculate how long your system should run when you're watering, well, kind of good luck, because unless you're growing a monoculture in your garden, your different beds are going to have different needs. So my recommendation, if you really want to calculate it, is to figure out what your thirstiest plant is and water that plant. So for example, pole beans only need a ½ gallon of water per square foot per day, which is not very much water for garden plants. On average, a tomato plant will need about 1 gallon of water per day. And on average, lettuce crops are going to need 2 to 3 gallons per row foot per day. So these plants have very different watering needs. If you want to tune your system to their needs, you can do that by putting different emitters with different flow rate emitters in different beds, or you can do what I do and just water for your thirstiest plants. Reading your plants is an invaluable tool in gardening. Learn to recognize signs of stress in your plants and they can't tell you why they're stressed. So if you suspect that it's water stress, then you go into the soil and you check it. Drip systems require some maintenance. Not a lot, actually. So in the spring, you're going to turn your system on and you're going to check for leaks, you're going to check for clogged emitters, and you're going to check for breaks. You're going to replace your parts as needed. Sometimes you can unclog an emitter. Usually you just replace it. They're relatively affordable. There's your spring. How often you flush your filter out is going to depend on how dirty your water source is and what type of filter it is. So that Beefy filter I've got on my secondary water supply, probably I should flush it out once a month, which is why I love that I have the flush valve on there.
He loves it.
Your inline filters from a culinary source should probably be flushed out at least annually. And the way you flush those is you screw them out of your system and you run water the opposite way through them. If you're in a 4-season climate, so excluding you guys again, Florida, sorry, you will also want to winterize your system, which I talked about earlier. That is system maintenance. Good winterization is going to reduce the amount of maintenance you have to do in the spring, which is a win, I think. This has probably been a more boring video than the other videos that I made about drip irrigation, but also I very much hope that it was packed with information. That's what those other videos lacked. So this is for you, this information dense, kind of boring, Dustin talking about drip irrigation video. I hope you found it useful. If you also found it entertaining, bonus points! Thank you for joining me here in my garden today. I hope you have a wonderful time in your own.